Before mass leaders seize the power to fit reality to their lies, their propaganda is marked by its extreme contempt for facts as such, for in their opinion fact depends entirely on the power of man who can fabricate it. The assertion that the Moscow subway is the only one in the world is a lie only so long as the Bolsheviks have not the power to destroy all the others. In other words, the method of infallible prediction, more than any other totalitarian propaganda device, betrays its ultimate goal of world conquest, since only in a world completely under his control could the totalitarian ruler possibly realize all his lies and make true all his prophecies. The language of prophetic scientificality corresponded to the needs of masses who had lost their home in the world and now were prepared to be reintegrated into eternal, all-dominating forces, which by themselves would bear man, the swimmer on the waves of adversity, to the shores of safety. We shape the life of our people and our legislation according to the verdicts of genetics, said the Nazis, just as the Bolsheviks assure their followers that economic forces have the power of a verdict of history. They thereby promise a victory which is independent of temporary defeats and failures in specific enterprises. For masses, in contrast to classes, want victory and success as such in their most abstract form. They are not bound together by those special collective interests which they feel to be essential to their survival as a group, and which they therefore may assert even in the face of overwhelming odds. More important to them than the cause that may be victorious or the particular enterprise that may be a success is the victory of no matter what cause and success in no matter what enterprise. Totalitarian propaganda perfects the techniques of mass propaganda, but it neither invents them nor originates their themes. These were prepared for them by 50 years of the rise of imperialism and disintegration of the nation-state, when the mob entered the scene of European politics. Like the earlier mob leaders, the spokesmen for totalitarian movements possessed an unerring instinct for anything that ordinary party propaganda or public opinion did not care or dare to touch. Everything hidden, everything passed over in silence, became of major significance regardless of its own intrinsic importance. The mob really believed that truth was whatever respectable society had hypocritically passed over or covered up with corruption. Mysteriousness as such became the first criterion for the choice of topics. The origin of mystery did not matter. It could lie in a reasonable, politically comprehensible desire for secrecy, as in the case of the British Secret Service or the French Deuxième Bureau, or in the conspiratory need of revolutionary groups, as in the case of anarchist and other terrorist sects, or in the structure of societies whose original secret content had long since become well known, and where only the formal rituals still retained the former mystery, as in the case of the Freemasons, or in age-old superstitions which had woven legends around certain groups, as in the case of the Jesuits and the Jews. The Nazis were undoubtedly superior in the selection of such topics for mass propaganda, but the Bolsheviks have gradually learned the trick, although they rely less on traditionally acceptable mysteries and prefer their own inventions. Since the middle 30s, one mysterious world conspiracy has followed another in Bolshevik propaganda, starting with the plot of the Trotskyites, followed by the rule of the 300 families, to the sinister imperialist, i.e. global machinations of the British or American secret services. The effectiveness of this kind of propaganda demonstrates one of the chief characteristics of modern masses. They do not believe in anything visible, in the reality of their own experience. They do not trust their eyes and ears, but only their imaginations, which may be caught by anything that is at once universal and consistent in itself. What convinces masses are not facts, and not even invented facts, but only the consistency of the system of which they are presumably part. Repetition, somewhat overrated in importance because of the common belief in the masses' inferior capacity to grasp and remember, is important only because it convinces them of consistency in time. What the masses refuse to recognize is the fortuitousness that pervades reality. They are predisposed to all ideologies, because they explain facts as mere examples of laws and eliminate coincidences by inventing an all-embracing omnipotence, which is supposed to be at the root of every accident. Totalitarian propaganda thrives on this escape from reality into fiction, from coincidence into consistency. The chief disability of totalitarian propaganda is that it cannot fulfill this longing of the masses for a completely consistent, comprehensible and predictable world without seriously conflicting with common sense. If, for instance, all the confessions of political opponents in the Soviet Union are phrased in the same language and admit the same motives, the consistency-hungry masses will accept the fiction as supreme proof of their truthfulness, whereas common sense tells us that it is precisely their consistency which is out of this world and proves that they're a fabrication. Figuratively speaking, it is as though the masses demand a constant repetition of the miracle of the Septuagint, when, according to ancient legend, 70 isolated translators produced an identical Greek version of the Old Testament. Common sense can accept this tale only as a legend or a miracle, yet it could also be adduced as proof of the absolute faithfulness of every single word in the translated text. In other words, while it is true that the masses are obsessed by a desire to escape from reality because in their essential homelessness they can no longer bear its accidental, incomprehensible aspects, it is also true that their longing for fiction has some connection with those capacities of the human mind whose structural consistency is superior to mere occurrence. The masses' escape from reality is a verdict against the world in which they are forced to live and in which they cannot exist, since coincidence has become its supreme master and human beings need the constant transformation of chaotic and accidental conditions into a man-made pattern of relative consistency. The revolt of the masses against realism, common sense, and all the plausibilities of the world, as Burke put it, was the result of their atomization, of their loss of social status, along with which they lost the whole sector of communal relationships in whose framework common sense makes sense. In their situation of spiritual and social homelessness, a measured insight into the interdependence of the arbitrary and the planned, the accidental and the necessary could no longer operate. Totalitarian propaganda can outrageously insult common sense, only where common sense has lost its validity. Before the alternative of facing the anarchic growth and total arbitrariness of decay, or bowing down before the most rigid, fantastically fictitious consistency of an ideology, the masses probably will always choose the latter and be ready to pay for it with individual sacrifices. And this not because they're stupid or wicked, but because in the general disaster this escape grants them a minimum of self-respect. Consistency. Before they seize power and establish a world according to their doctrines, totalitarian movements conjure up a lying world of consistency, which is more adequate to the needs of the human mind than reality itself, in which through sheer imagination uprooted masses can feel at home and are spared the never-ending shocks which real life and real experiences deal to human beings and their expectations. The force possessed by totalitarian propaganda, before the movements have the power to drop iron curtains to prevent anyone's disturbing by the slightest reality the gruesome quiet of an entirely imaginary world, lies in its ability to shut the masses off from the real world. The only signs which the real world still offers to the understanding of the unintegrated and disintegrating masses, whom every new stroke of ill luck makes more gullible, are, so to speak, its lacunae, the questions it does not care to discuss publicly, or the rumours it does not dare to contradict, because they hit, although in an exaggerated and deformed way, some sore spot. From these sore spots, the lies of totalitarian propaganda drive the element of truthfulness and real experience they need to bridge the gulf between reality and fiction. Only terror could rely on mere fiction, and even the terror-sustained lying fictions of totalitarian regimes have not yet become entirely arbitrary, although they are usually cruder, more impudent, and, so to speak, more original than those of the movements. It takes power, not propaganda skill, to circulate a revised history of the Russian Revolution in which no man by the name of Trotsky was ever commander-in-chief of the Red Army. The lies of the movements, on the other hand, are much subtler. They attach themselves to every aspect of social and political life that is hidden from the public eye. They succeed best where the official authorities have surrounded themselves with an atmosphere of secrecy. In the eyes of the masses, they then acquire the reputation of superior realism because they touch upon real conditions whose existence is being hidden. Revelations of scandals in high society, of corruption of politicians, everything that belongs to yellow journalism becomes in their hands a weapon of more than sensational importance. The most efficient fiction of Nazi propaganda was the story of a Jewish world conspiracy. Concentration on anti-Semitic propaganda had been a common device of demagogues ever since the end of the 19th century and was widespread in the Germany and Austria of the 1920s. The more consistently a discussion of the Jewish question was avoided by all parties and organs of public opinion, the more convinced the mob became that Jews were the true representatives of the powers that be, and that the Jewish issue was the symbol for the hypocrisy and dishonesty of the whole system. The actual content of post-war anti-Semitic propaganda was neither a monopoly of the Nazis nor particularly new and original. Lies about a Jewish world conspiracy had been current since the Dreyfus affair and based themselves on the existing international interrelationship and interdependence of a Jewish people dispersed all over the world. One thing was undeniable. In the post-war period, Jews had become more prominent than ever before. The point about the Jews themselves is that they grew prominent and conspicuous in inverse proportion to their real influence and position of power. Every decrease in the stability and force of the nation-states was a direct blow to Jewish positions. The partially successful conquest of the state by the nation made it impossible for the government machine to maintain its position above all classes and parties, and thereby nullified the value of alliances with the Jewish sector of the population, which was supposed also to stay outside the rank of society and to be indifferent to party politics. Nazi propaganda was ingenious enough to transform anti-Semitism into a principle of self-definition, and thus to eliminate it from the fluctuations of mere opinion. It used the persuasion of mass demagogy only as a preparatory step, and never overestimated its lasting influence, whether in oratory or in print. This gave the masses of atomized, undefinable, unstable and futile individuals a means of self-definition and identification, which not only restored some of the self-respect they'd formerly derived from their function in society, but also created a kind of spurious stability which made them better candidates for an organization. Through this kind of propaganda, the movement could set itself up as an artificial extension of the mass meeting and rationalize the essentially futile feelings of self-importance and hysterical security that it offered to the isolated individuals of an atomized society. The same ingenious application of slogans, coined by others and tried out before, was apparent in the Nazis' treatment of other relevant issues. When public attention was equally focused on nationalism on one hand and socialism on the other, when the two were thought to be incompatible and actually constituted the ideological watershed between the right and the left, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, Nazi, offered a synthesis supposed to lead to national unity, a semantic solution whose double trademark of German and worker connected the nationalism of the right with the internationalism of the left. It is interesting that even in their beginnings the Nazis were prudent enough never to use slogans which, like democracy, republic, dictatorship or monarchy, indicated a specific form of government. It is as though in this one matter they'd always known that they would be entirely original. Every discussion about the actual form of their future government could be dismissed as empty talk about mere formalities, the state, according to Hitler, being only a means for the conservation of the race, as the state, according to Bolshevik propaganda, is only an instrument in the struggle of classes. In another curious and roundabout way, however, the Nazis gave a propaganda answer to the question of what their future role would be, and that was in their use of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion as a model for the future organisation of the German masses for world empire. The use of the protocols was not restricted to the Nazis. Hundreds of thousands of copies were sold in post-war Germany, and even their open adoption as a handbook of politics was not new. Nevertheless, this forgery was mainly used for the purpose of denouncing the Jews and arousing the mob to the dangers of Jewish domination. In terms of mere propaganda, the discovery of the Nazis was that the masses were not so frightened by Jewish world rule as they were interested in how it could be done, that the popularity of the protocols was based on admiration and eagerness to learn rather than on hatred, and that it would be wise to stay as close as possible to certain of their outstanding formulas, as in the case of the famous slogan, "Right is what is good for the German people," which was copied from the protocols. Everything that benefits the Jewish people is morally right and sacred. The protocols are a very curious and noteworthy document in many respects. Apart from their cheap Machiavellianism, their essential political characteristic is that in their crackpot manner they touch on every important political issue of the time. They are anti-national in principle and picture the nation-state as a colossus with feet of clay. They discard national sovereignty and believe, as Hitler once put it, in a world empire on a national basis. They are not satisfied with revolution in a particular country, but aim at the conquest and rule of the world. They promise the people that regardless of superiority in numbers, territory and state power, they will be able to achieve world conquest through organisation alone. To be sure, part of their persuasive strength derives from very old elements of superstition. The notion of the uninterrupted existence of an international sect that has pursued the same revolutionary aims since antiquity is very old and has played a role in political backstairs literature ever since the French Revolution, even though it did not occur to anyone writing at the end of the 18th century that the revolutionary sect, this peculiar nation in the midst of all civilized nations, could be the Jews. It was the motif of a global conspiracy in the protocols which appealed most to the masses, for it corresponded so well to the new power situation. Hitler very early promised that the Nazi movement would transcend the narrow limits of modern nationalism, and during the war attempts were made within the SS to erase the word nation from the National Socialist vocabulary altogether. Only world powers seemed still to have a chance of independent survival, and only global politics a chance of lasting results. That this situation should frighten the smaller nations, which are not world powers, is only too understandable. The protocols seem to show a way out that did not depend upon objective, unalterable conditions, but only on the power of organisation. Nazi propaganda, in other words, discovered in the supranational because intensely national Jew the forerunner of the German master of the world, and assured the masses that the nations that have been the first to see through the Jew and have been the first to fight him are going to take his place in the domination of the world. The delusion of an already existing Jewish world domination formed the basis for the illusion of future German world domination. This was what Himmler had in mind when he stated that we owe the art of government to the Jews, namely to the protocols, which the Führer had learned by heart. Thus the protocols presented world conquest as a practical possibility, implied that the whole affair was only a question of inspired or shrewd know-how, and that nobody stood in the way of a German victory over the entire world, but a patently small people, the Jews, who ruled it without possessing instruments of violence. An easy opponent, therefore, once their secret was discovered and their method emulated on a larger scale.